October 1944. The Allied Supreme Commander stared at the map of occupied Europe, his jaw clenched. Dwight Eisenhower had just received the casualty reports from the Scheldt Estuary, and what he read made his blood run cold. Over 41,000 German soldiers had been killed, wounded, or captured in one of the most savage campaigns of the entire war. But here's what nobody expected. The force that delivered this devastating blow wasn't American. It wasn't British. It was Canadian. And the man who orchestrated this brutal victory was a general that history has almost forgotten. General Harry Crerar had just proven that Canada's military could fight and win against the most fortified German positions in Western Europe. When Eisenhower finally spoke about what happened at the Scheldt, his words would change how the world viewed Canadian soldiers forever. But before we get to what he said, you need to understand why this battle was so important, why it was so brutal, and why the Canadians were chosen for what many called a suicide mission. September 1944 should have been a moment of triumph. The Allies had landed in Normandy, broken through German defenses, liberated Paris, and were racing across France and Belgium. American and British forces were pushing toward Germany's borders. The war seemed like it might end by Christmas. Antwerp, Europe's second-largest port, had been captured virtually intact on September 4th. This should have solved the Allies' massive supply problem. Hundreds of thousands of tons of ammunition, fuel, food, and equipment could flow through Antwerp's massive docks directly to the front lines. But there was one catastrophic problem that would cost thousands of lives to fix. The port of Antwerp sits 55 miles inland from the North Sea, connected by the Scheldt Estuary, a wide waterway that snakes through the Netherlands and Belgium. And every inch of that waterway was controlled by the Germans. The port itself might have been in Allied hands, but it was completely useless. Not a single supply ship could reach it. German artillery batteries lined both banks of the estuary. German fortifications, mines, and obstacles blocked the channels. And holding all of these positions were some of the toughest German units still fighting in the West. The 15th Army had escaped the Normandy pocket and dug in along the Scheldt like their lives depended on it. Because they did. Hitler had given explicit orders. Hold the Scheldt at all costs. Deny the Allies the use of Antwerp. Make them pay in blood for every mile. The Führer understood what many Allied generals initially missed. Without Antwerp's port capacity, the Allied advance would grind to a halt. Trucks carrying supplies from distant beaches in Normandy couldn't keep pace with the armies racing toward Germany. The logistics were impossible. The German High Command knew that if they could hold the Scheldt through the winter, they might buy enough time to regroup, rebuild, and turn the tide. They were willing to sacrifice an entire army to make that happen. By late September, the Allied advance had indeed stalled. Tanks sat immobile for lack of fuel. Artillery batteries rationed shells. Soldiers went hungry. The ambitious Operation Market Garden had failed disastrously at Arnhem, costing thousands of paratroopers their lives. British Field Marshal Montgomery's plan to bounce across the Rhine and into Germany had turned into a bloodbath. The front was stabilizing. The Germans were recovering. And Eisenhower was furious. He needed Antwerp open. He needed it desperately. But who could break the German stranglehold on the Scheldt? Enter General Harry Crerar and the 1st Canadian Army. Crerar was not a flamboyant general. He didn't give rousing speeches or seek glory. He was methodical, careful, and absolutely determined. Born in Hamilton, Ontario, Crerar had served in World War I as an artillery officer. He understood warfare's brutal mathematics. He knew what it took to break prepared defensive positions. And he knew that the battle for the Scheldt was going to be a nightmare. The terrain alone was a defender's dream and an attacker's hell. Much of the region sits below sea level, protected by dikes and flooded fields. The Germans had opened sluices and deliberately flooded huge areas, creating a nightmarish landscape of water, mud, and isolated patches of solid ground. Movement was channeled into predictable routes that German artillery had pre-registered. Every approach was covered by machine gun nests, concrete bunkers, and minefields. The Canadians weren't just facing difficult terrain. They were facing the Breskens pocket south of the estuary, where German forces had fortified every village and farm. They were facing the South Beveland Peninsula, a narrow causeway where attackers would be exposed to murderous fire from 3 sides. And most terrifying of all, they were facing Walcheren Island at the mouth of the estuary, a fortress bristling with massive coastal artillery batteries and reinforced concrete casemates. These weren't ordinary field guns. These were naval guns, some with ranges exceeding 20 miles, capable of sinking battleships. The guns of Walcheren could obliterate any Allied ship trying to enter the Scheldt. Taking them would require amphibious assaults against fortified positions. The planners compared it to a miniature D-Day, except this time the defenders would be ready and waiting. Crerar assembled his forces. The 1st Canadian Army wasn't just Canadians. Under his command were British, Polish, Belgian and other Allied units. But the core fighting divisions were Canadian, including the battle-hardened 2nd and 3rd Canadian Infantry Divisions and the 4th Canadian Armoured Division. These men had fought through Normandy's hedgerows, liberated French towns and battled their way through Belgium. They were veterans. They were tough. But nothing had prepared them for what was coming. Crerar knew the casualties would be appalling. The terrain, the weather, the enemy's determination, everything favored the defenders. But the mission was non-negotiable. Antwerp had to be opened. The war depended on it. On October 2, 1944, the Battle of the Scheldt began. The first objective was clearing the Breskens pocket, the German-held territory south of the estuary. The Canadian 3rd Division moved into flooded polders where the only dry ground was narrow roads and dikes. They advanced through waist-deep water in freezing conditions. German machine gunners fired from concealed positions in farmhouses and bunkers. Mortars rained down from pre-plotted coordinates. Every step forward came at a terrible price. Soldiers drowned in shell holes. Others were cut down by crossfire. The mud sucked at their boots, making every movement exhausting. Evacuating wounded men became a nightmare in itself. Stretcher bearers struggled through the muck, often taking hours to reach medical stations. The fighting was intimate and savage. Small units would clear one building at a time, throwing grenades into cellars, engaging in close-quarters combat with bayonets and rifle butts. The Germans fought with fanatic determination, knowing they had nowhere to retreat. Every bunker had to be reduced with flamethrowers or explosives. Every trench had to be cleared section by section. The Canadians discovered that the Germans had turned the Breskens pocket into a maze of interconnected defensive positions. Knock out one and fire would come from another. The advance was measured in yards, not miles. After 3 days of fighting, Canadian casualties were mounting alarmingly. Officers radioed for more men, more ammunition, more artillery support. The battle was turning into a meat grinder. Meanwhile, further east, Canadian forces launched attacks toward South Beveland. This narrow peninsula was even worse than Breskens. The land rose slightly from the flooded polders, creating a natural causeway just a few hundred yards wide. German defenders occupied every building, every ditch, every possible position. Canadian troops advancing up the peninsula were exposed to artillery fire from the mainland to their left, from Walcheren Island to their right, and from positions directly ahead. It was a killing ground. The Royal Hamilton Light Infantry and other units attacked again and again, taking devastating casualties. Men fell by the dozens. Entire platoons were wiped out. Company commanders were killed and replaced, sometimes multiple times in a single day. The advance continued simply because stopping meant dying anyway. German artillery could hit anywhere on the peninsula. The weather turned against the Canadians. October brought cold rain that never seemed to stop. Soldiers lived in muddy foxholes that constantly filled with water. Trench foot became epidemic. Men's feet rotted in their boots. The wounded often suffered more from exposure than from their actual injuries. Supplies had to be brought forward through the same killing zones that the troops had just crossed. Ammunition carriers became casualties. Food was cold and scarce. Sleep was impossible. The psychological strain was immense. Veterans who had survived Normandy said the Scheldt was worse. At least in Normandy you could see the enemy. Here, death came from invisible artillery batteries and well-concealed snipers. Back in the Breskens pocket, Canadian engineers performed miracles. They built bridges across flooded areas under fire. They cleared mines by hand, often paying with their lives. They brought up amphibious vehicles called weasels that could navigate the flooded terrain. Slowly, methodically, the Canadians compressed the German pocket. They cut off German supply lines. They brought in massive artillery concentrations, turning entire grid squares into moonscapes. The Germans fought back with everything they had. They launched counterattacks at night, trying to recapture lost positions. They called down their own artillery on their former positions if the Canadians occupied them. They fought from the rubble of destroyed buildings and from positions in the dikes themselves. By late October, the Breskens pocket was nearly cleared, but at a horrific cost. Thousands of Canadians had been killed or wounded. Entire battalions had been decimated. Soldiers who had landed on D-Day were now dead in Dutch mud. Families back in Canada would receive telegrams that would shatter their worlds. But there was no time to mourn. South Beveland still had to be taken, and beyond that loomed Walcheren Island, the most formidable objective of all. The assault on South Beveland intensified. Canadian and British forces attacked from multiple directions, trying to split German defenses. The fighting in towns like Wenstrecht became legendary for its savagery. Buildings changed hands multiple times. Streets ran with blood. The wounded lay in basements and cellars, unable to be evacuated until the fighting subsided. German snipers picked off medics. Canadian soldiers responded with flamethrowers and phosphorus grenades. The rules of civilized warfare dissolved in the mud and rain. This was survival. This was kill or be killed. By November 1st, South Beveland had finally fallen. The causeway to Walcheren Island lay ahead. Walcheren presented an entirely different challenge. The island's massive concrete fortifications couldn't be taken by infantry assault alone. British bombers had already conducted raids, deliberately breaching the dikes at 3 locations. The sea poured in, flooding most of the island and isolating the German positions. This sounds like it would help the attackers, but it actually made things worse in some ways. The German strongpoints became islands in a cold sea, accessible only by small boats under fire. The civilians who hadn't evacuated were trapped and drowning. The Canadians who would assault these positions would have to do so in landing craft, just like D-Day, except the enemy would be waiting in prepared positions. On November 1st, British commandos and Canadian troops launched amphibious assaults on Walcheren. The landing at West Capelle became one of the bloodiest small-unit actions of the war. Support ships tried to suppress the German coastal batteries but were torn apart by return fire. The landing craft approached through heavy fire. Men jumped into chest-deep water and waded toward the beach, many cut down before reaching dry land. Those who made it ashore found themselves facing concrete bunkers with overlapping fields of fire. The assault stalled. Casualties mounted. Officers called for naval gunfire, air support, anything to suppress the German guns. Slowly, through sheer courage and determination, the Canadians and British established a foothold. The fighting on Walcheren continued for days. Each bunker had to be taken individually. Canadian engineers brought up explosive charges to blow the steel doors. Infantry would rush in, clearing the interior in vicious close-quarters combat. German defenders fought room to room, sometimes detonating their own ammunition rather than surrender. The cold water surrounding every position meant that wounded men often drowned before they could be rescued. The psychological horror of fighting in a partially submerged fortress, where every corridor might flood, where every explosion might bring tons of water crashing down, broke even veteran soldiers. By November 8th, Walcheren was finally in Allied hands. The last German strongpoints had surrendered or been eliminated. Canadian and British engineers immediately began clearing the Scheldt of mines. The channel had been sown with thousands of naval mines, designed to sink any ship attempting passage. Minesweepers worked around the clock, under sporadic German artillery fire from distant positions. Finally, on November 28, 1944, nearly 3 months after Antwerp had been captured, the first Allied convoy reached the port. The Scheldt was open. The cost had been staggering. The 1st Canadian Army suffered over 12,000 casualties killed, wounded, and missing. British and Polish units under Canadian command suffered thousands more. The psychological casualties, those who broke under the strain, numbered in the thousands but were never officially counted. Entire companies had been wiped out. Regiments that had fought across France with pride were now shadows of their former strength. The veterans who survived the Scheldt carried the memories forever. They would wake up screaming about drowning in mud. They would flinch at thunder that sounded like artillery. They would see the faces of friends who had died beside them. But the German losses were even more catastrophic. Over 41,000 German soldiers had been killed, wounded, or captured in the fighting. Entire divisions had ceased to exist. The 64th Infantry Division, the 70th Infantry Division, the 346th Infantry Division, all had been shattered. The 15th Army, which had escaped Normandy intact, had been destroyed defending the Scheldt. These weren't just numbers in a casualty report. These were fathers, sons, brothers. These were young men who had been told they were defending civilization. They had fought with courage even as their cause was lost. The battlefield was littered with their bodies. Dutch civilians emerging from cellars found streets filled with corpses, destroyed vehicles, and the wreckage of what had been their towns. When the full scope of the Canadian victory became clear, Eisenhower's reaction was immediate and unequivocal. The Supreme Commander, who had often been frustrated by Montgomery's caution and disputes over strategy, found in the Canadians exactly what he needed. They had been given an impossible mission and had accomplished it through sheer grit and determination. In his communications and later statements, Eisenhower praised the Canadian achievement in terms that shocked even Crerar. He stated that the opening of Antwerp was as important as any single Allied victory in the European theater. He acknowledged that the Canadians had fought through conditions worse than Normandy. He recognized that without their success at the Scheldt, the entire Allied advance would have collapsed. But the most powerful thing Eisenhower said came in a personal message to Crerar. The exact wording varies in different accounts, but the substance was this. Eisenhower acknowledged that he had asked the Canadians to do the impossible. He admitted that the mission had required a level of sacrifice and determination that few armies could sustain. And he stated clearly that the Canadian First Army had proven itself equal to any fighting force in the world. Coming from the man who commanded American, British, and French armies, who had directed the D-Day landings and the liberation of Western Europe, this was extraordinary praise. Eisenhower, who was usually measured and diplomatic in his statements, was emphatic. The Canadians had delivered when it mattered most. This praise wasn't just pleasant words. Eisenhower backed it up with actions. He ensured that Canadian units received priority for reinforcements and supplies. He gave Crerar more autonomy in planning operations. He made sure that Canadian contributions were recognized in official communiques and press releases. For a brief moment, the world's attention focused on what the Canadians had accomplished. Newspaper headlines celebrated the victory. Newsreels showed Canadian soldiers being greeted as liberators by Dutch civilians. The Canadian flag flew over the ruins of Walcheren's fortifications. But here's what's tragic. Within months, the Scheldt victory was overshadowed by other events. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 captured headlines with its dramatic German offensive and American defensive stand. The crossing of the Rhine and the final push into Germany dominated the narrative in early 1945. By the time the war ended in May, most people outside Canada had forgotten about the Scheldt. Even within military history, the battle became a footnote. Books about World War II devoted chapters to D-Day, Market Garden, the Bulge, and the Rhine crossing. The Scheldt, if mentioned at all, got a few paragraphs. This historical amnesia is deeply unfair. The Battle of the Scheldt was strategically more important than Market Garden, which failed, or the Bulge, which was a desperate German gamble that delayed but didn't change the outcome. Without the Scheldt, Antwerp couldn't function. Without Antwerp, the Allied armies would have starved for supplies through the winter of 1944-45. The war might have dragged into 1946. Thousands of additional soldiers and civilians would have died. The atomic bomb might have been used in Europe instead of Japan. The strategic importance of opening Antwerp cannot be overstated. And it was Canadian soldiers who made it possible. Why did the Scheldt get forgotten? Part of the reason is that Canada, despite its massive contribution to the war effort, was a junior partner in the alliance. It didn't have the population or economic power of the United States or Britain. Canadian voices were often drowned out in the post-war narrative. American historians naturally focused on American achievements. British historians did the same. Canadian history was, and often still is, overlooked by the larger world. Another reason is the nature of the battle itself. The Scheldt wasn't a dramatic breakthrough or a last-ditch defensive stand. It was a grinding, methodical campaign to clear fortified positions in terrible terrain. It wasn't visually spectacular like tank battles in the desert or strategic bombing raids. It was infantry slogging through mud, 1 yard at a time. It was engineers clearing mines by hand. It was artillery pounding German positions for hours before assaults. It was brutal, unglamorous work that resulted in victory through attrition and willpower rather than tactical brilliance or technological superiority. But perhaps the deepest reason the Scheldt was forgotten is because remembering it is painful. The casualties, the suffering, the sheer horror of what those men endured doesn't fit comfortable narratives about the good war. We like our World War II stories to have clear heroes and villains, dramatic moments of triumph, and not too much dwelling on the blood and mud. The Scheldt forces us to confront the reality that winning the war required thousands of young men to wade through freezing water under machine gun fire, to attack concrete bunkers with flamethrowers, to watch their friends die and keep fighting. It required generals to order attacks knowing that many of the men wouldn't come back. It required a level of sacrifice that's uncomfortable to think about. The veterans themselves often didn't talk about it. Men who survived the Scheldt came home to Canada and tried to resume normal lives. They married, had children, built careers. When asked about the war, many would say little. The memories were too painful. The experiences were too far removed from civilian life to explain. How do you tell your family about drowning in mud? How do you describe the smell of death in flooded farmhouses? How do you explain why you wake up screaming 3 decades later? It was easier to stay silent. and so the stories were lost. Only in recent decades, as the veterans have aged and historians have dug deeper into Canadian military records, has the true scope of the Scheldt campaign been recognized. The Canadian War Museum in Ottawa has exhibits dedicated to the battle. Dutch communities along the Scheldt hold annual commemorations. Memorials have been erected. But for most of the world, the Battle of the Scheldt remains unknown. Even many Canadians don't know about it. Ask random people to name a Canadian World War II battle, and most will struggle. Ask them about the Scheldt specifically, and blank looks follow. This is why Eisenhower's recognition at the time was so important. He saw what the Canadians achieved. He understood the strategic significance. He acknowledged the sacrifice. His words validated what those soldiers had endured. When a Scheldt veteran heard that the Supreme Allied commander had praised their achievement, it meant something. It meant their friends hadn't died for nothing. It meant the pain had purpose. It meant someone important understood. General Harry Crerar himself never sought glory. After the war, he retired quietly and died in 1965, largely unknown outside military circles. He never wrote memoirs dramatizing his achievements. He didn't give interviews claiming credit. He was content to have done his duty. But those who served under him knew the truth. Crerar had planned and executed one of the most difficult operations of the entire war. He had done it with limited resources, difficult terrain, terrible weather, and a determined enemy. He had accomplished the mission. And he had done it with a level of professionalism that earned respect even from those who questioned his methods. The individual Canadian units that fought in the Scheldt developed reputations that would carry through the rest of the war and beyond. The Royal Hamilton Light Infantry, the Regina Rifles, the Essex Scottish, the Calgary Highlanders, dozens of regiments proved their worth in the bloodiest combat of the Western Front. When Canadian units appeared on the battlefield in subsequent operations, German intelligence officers noted it. These weren't green troops anymore. These were veterans who had broken fortified positions that many thought impregnable. They were treated with respect and caution. The Dutch population liberated during and after the Scheldt campaign never forgot. Unlike France or Belgium, where liberation came relatively quickly, the Netherlands suffered through a terrible winter in 1944–45. German forces continued to occupy the western part of the country, imposing starvation conditions on the civilian population. When Canadian forces finally liberated all of the Netherlands in April and May 1945, the Dutch people embraced them as saviors. That gratitude has endured. To this day, the Netherlands maintains close ties with Canada. Dutch schoolchildren learn about Canadian soldiers. Dutch families tend Canadian war graves. Every year, the Netherlands sends thousands of tulip bulbs to Canada as a gift of thanks. This relationship is a direct legacy of the Scheldt and the broader Canadian liberation of the Netherlands. Looking back from our perspective more than 80 years later, the Battle of the Scheldt offers profound lessons. It demonstrates that strategic victory often comes through unglamorous hard fighting rather than brilliant maneuvers. It shows that technological superiority isn't everything. Terrain and weather can equalize many advantages. It proves that well-led infantry, properly supported by artillery and engineers, can overcome seemingly impregnable defenses. Most importantly, it reminds us that freedom isn't free. Those Canadian soldiers who died in Dutch mud paid the ultimate price so that Europe could be liberated and so that future generations could live in peace. The 41,000 German casualties tell another story. These were men fighting for an evil cause, but many were conscripts who had little choice. The tragedy is that so many had to die for a regime that was already doomed. By October 1944, Germany had clearly lost the war. The Scheldt campaign, from the German perspective, was a delaying action that couldn't change the outcome, only postpone it. Those soldiers died defending the indefensible, sacrificed by leaders who cared nothing for their lives. The SS units and fanatic Nazi defenders bear moral responsibility for the carnage. They could have surrendered and saved lives on both sides. Instead, they chose to fight to the death, taking thousands of their own men with them. The civilians caught in the crossfire suffered immensely. Dutch families huddled in cellars as artillery shells demolished their homes. They watched their towns destroyed. They lost family members to stray bullets and collapsing buildings. Many drowned when the dikes were breached. Children grew up traumatized by what they had witnessed. The psychological scars lasted generations. Yet these same civilians welcomed their Canadian liberators with tears and gratitude. The contrast between the brutality of the battle and the joy of liberation created complex emotions that many Dutch people struggle to articulate even today. Eisenhower understood all of this. He wasn't just a distant commander moving pins on a map. He visited the front. He spoke with wounded soldiers. He read casualty reports. He knew the price being paid. When he praised the Canadians, it wasn't empty rhetoric. It was genuine recognition from a man who understood the full cost of what had been achieved. His words gave meaning to the sacrifice. They validated the pain. They ensured that, at least officially, the achievement would be recognized. The logistical impact of opening Antwerp was immediate and dramatic. Within weeks, the port was handling tens of thousands of tons of supplies daily. The backlog of material that had been piling up at distant beaches and ports flowed through Antwerp directly to frontline units. Tanks that had been immobilized for lack of fuel were running again. Artillery batteries that had been rationing shells were firing full barrages. Soldiers who had been hungry were eating hot meals. The entire Allied war machine, which had been grinding to a halt in September and October, roared back to life in December and January. This directly enabled the response to the German Bulge offensive and the subsequent push into Germany. Without Antwerp, the war timeline changes dramatically. Modern military historians who study logistics recognize the Scheldt as a textbook example of why ports matter. Armies don't just need men and weapons, they need continuous supplies of fuel, ammunition, food, medical supplies, and replacement equipment. In 1944, with no computer-controlled supply chains or modern transportation networks, getting supplies from ships to frontline units was incredibly difficult. Every mile supplies traveled reduced efficiency. Trucks broke down. Fuel was consumed just transporting fuel. The math was unforgiving. Antwerp solved this problem, but only after Canadian soldiers had cleared the Scheldt at tremendous cost. The individual stories from the Scheldt are heartbreaking. Young men who had joined up out of patriotism or adventure found themselves in a hell they couldn't have imagined. Letters home, when they could be written, tried to reassure families while concealing the truth of what was happening. Soldiers developed grim humor as a coping mechanism. They gave gallows humor nicknames to particularly dangerous locations. They made bets about survival odds. They formed bonds with their comrades that were deeper than almost any other human relationship because they depended on each other absolutely. When those bonds were broken by death, the surviving soldiers grieved in ways that never fully healed. Medical personnel who served in the Scheldt faced impossible situations. Doctors and nurses performed surgery in makeshift facilities under fire. They triaged casualties, deciding who could be saved and who couldn't. They worked until exhaustion, then worked more. The wounds they treated were horrific. High-velocity bullets shattered bones. Artillery fragments tore flesh. Burns from flamethrowers and phosphorus required immediate treatment. Drowning victims needed resuscitation. Hypothermia was epidemic. Trench foot required amputation if left untreated. The medical staff saved thousands of lives, but they also watched thousands die despite their best efforts. Many doctors and nurses came home with their own psychological trauma from what they had witnessed. Chaplains who served with the Canadian forces in the Scheldt provided spiritual support to men facing death. They held impromptu services in muddy foxholes. They prayed with the dying. They wrote letters to families. They conducted burial services, often for multiple men at once. They grappled with theological questions that had no good answers. How do you explain why God allows such suffering? How do you provide comfort to a 19-year-old who knows he's dying far from home? The chaplains did their best, and their presence meant something to soldiers who needed to believe that their sacrifice had meaning beyond the immediate military objective. The support troops who made the combat possible rarely get recognition. Logistics personnel who moved supplies forward under fire. Cooks who prepared meals in terrible conditions. Mechanics who kept vehicles running. Signal Corps operators who maintained communications. Medical orderlies who evacuated wounded. Combat engineers who built bridges and cleared mines. Every one of these roles was essential. Many of these support personnel became casualties themselves, killed or wounded while performing their duties. The battle consumed everyone involved, not just the infantry at the front. Canadian war correspondents who covered the Scheldt tried to convey the horror to audiences back home, but censorship and editorial decisions often softened the reality. Newspapers wanted to maintain morale, not depress readers with graphic descriptions of combat. Newsreels showed sanitized versions of the battle. The full truth only emerged later in memoirs and historical accounts. Even then, many aspects remained difficult to convey. How do you communicate the constant fear, the exhaustion so complete that men fell asleep standing up, the guilt of surviving when friends died? These experiential realities resist capture in words or images. The German perspective on the Scheldt is less documented but equally tragic. Soldiers in the 15th Army knew they were being sacrificed. Many wanted to surrender but couldn't because of SS units behind the lines who would shoot deserters. Others fought on out of loyalty to their comrades, not to Hitler or Nazi ideology. Some genuinely believed the propaganda that they were defending Europe from Bolshevism. Whatever their motivations, they fought skillfully and bravely, even in a lost cause. The German junior officers and NCOs who led the defense showed tactical competence that Canadian commanders acknowledged. But they were doomed by strategic circumstances beyond their control. When the battle ended, both sides faced the grim task of dealing with the dead. Burial details worked for weeks recovering bodies from flooded areas, collapsed bunkers and shell craters. Many bodies were never recovered, buried under mud or carried away by water. The official casualty figures are estimates because exact counts were impossible. Soldiers buried in temporary graves were later exhumed and reinterred in proper cemeteries. The Canadian War Cemetery in Grosbeek, Netherlands holds thousands of graves from the Scheldt and other battles. Walking through those rows of white headstones, reading the names and ages, brings the cost into stark focus. General Eisenhower's recognition of the Canadian achievement at the Scheldt was important not just militarily but politically. Canada had joined the war voluntarily in 1939, sending hundreds of thousands of soldiers overseas. The Canadian government and people wanted their contribution recognized. They didn't want to be treated as mere auxiliaries to Britain or America. Eisenhower's praise helped validate Canada's role as a significant Allied power. It gave Canadian political leaders ammunition to argue for a seat at the table in post-war planning. It provided a point of national pride during a war that had asked so much of Canadian families. The long-term impact on Canadian military identity was profound. The Scheldt, along with earlier battles like Vimy Ridge in World War I and the Dieppe Raid and D-Day in World War II, became touchstones of Canadian military heritage. They demonstrated that Canadian forces could accomplish difficult missions through determination and skill. This tradition influenced Canadian military culture for decades. When Canadian forces deployed to Korea, to peacekeeping missions to Afghanistan, they carried with them the legacy of battles like the Scheldt. The expectation was that Canadian soldiers would be tough, reliable, and capable of getting the job done regardless of obstacles. For the individual soldiers who survived the Scheldt, the memories shaped the rest of their lives. Many struggled with what we now call PTSD, but what was then called shell shock or battle fatigue if recognized at all. They had nightmares. They startled at loud noises. They found it hard to readjust to civilian life where people complained about trivial problems. Some turned to alcohol to numb the memories. Others became withdrawn, unable to connect emotionally with family members who couldn't understand what they had experienced. A fortunate few found healing through comradeship with fellow veterans, gathering at Legion halls to share stories with men who understood. As the years passed and veterans aged, many became more willing to talk about their experiences. In the 1980s and 1990s, historians conducted extensive interviews with Scheldt survivors. These oral histories captured details that official records missed. The veterans described specific incidents, emotional states, and personal observations that brought the battle to life in ways that casualty statistics and operation orders couldn't. These interviews are now invaluable historical resources, preserving first-hand accounts before all the veterans pass away. The last survivors of the Scheldt are now in their late 90s or have already died. Soon there will be no living witnesses. The Dutch people's gratitude toward Canadian soldiers has been passed down through generations. Dutch parents told their children about the Canadians who liberated them. Those children told their children. Schools in the Netherlands teach about Canadian involvement in their liberation. Dutch citizens volunteer to maintain Canadian war graves. When Canadian veterans return to the Netherlands for commemorations, they are treated as honored guests. This intergenerational gratitude is rare in international relations. It stems directly from the terrible battles like the Scheldt, where Canadians paid in blood to free Dutch civilians from Nazi occupation. The strategic lessons from the Scheldt remain relevant. Modern military planners study the battle as an example of joint operations involving infantry, armor, artillery, engineers, and amphibious forces. The challenges of fighting in difficult terrain against prepared defenses are timeless. The importance of logistics and supply lines is even more critical in modern warfare. The need for political will to sustain costly operations toward strategic objectives hasn't changed. The Scheldt teaches that sometimes there's no clever way around a problem, you have to fight through it directly regardless of cost. What Eisenhower said when Crerar annihilated those 41,000 Germans at the Scheldt ultimately wasn't just about tactics or strategy. It was about recognizing human achievement and sacrifice. It was about acknowledging that these Canadian soldiers, led by a methodical general who didn't seek glory, had accomplished something extraordinary. They had broken German defenses that many thought impregnable. They had done it through courage, determination, and willingness to pay a terrible price. They had opened Antwerp and changed the course of the war in Western Europe. And they had done it while the world's attention was elsewhere, in muddy fields and flooded polders that most people had never heard of and would soon forget. Eisenhower's words, whatever the exact phrasing, meant that someone important understood and acknowledged what had been achieved. For the soldiers who fought through that hell, for the families of those who didn't come home, that recognition mattered. It gave meaning to the sacrifice. It validated the pain. It ensured that, at least in official history, the truth would be recorded. The Canadians had won a brutal victory at the Scheldt. They had annihilated 41,000 Germans through methodical, savage fighting in the worst conditions imaginable. And the Supreme Allied Commander had seen it, understood it, and honored it. That's what Eisenhower said, and that's why it matters still.